First question, if I may, though, and I'll direct it to Maxine and also Sienna. Maxine, I know that when you were advocating for the passage of Prop K, your opponents often said that, you know, if Prop K were passed, that it would inhibit police efforts at preventing, you know, human trafficking. This was an argument that I heard. Did you have any response or comments to that?
My response to that in the campaign was that is a scare tactic to scare voters away from supporting Prop K. You know, there's a lot of money in the trafficking rhetoric, and some of you may have encountered that already through some of the NGOs who are getting big money from the feds in the state to combat trafficking, but the numbers are just really not there. One of the things that happened during the collection of signatures is a woman declined to sign the petition to qualify Prop K because she said there were 10,000 child prostitutes working in the Bay Area, and she was afraid that somehow decriminalizing prostitution was going to promote child prostitution. And I said to her, you know, I've been working in the Bay Area for a long time, and there isn't even 10,000 prostitutes working in the Bay Area, let alone 10,000 child prostitutes working in the Bay Area. And if there were 10,000 child prostitutes working in the Bay Area, I would know about it. So it's built, the whole trafficking rhetoric is built on really a whole series of lies that conflate prostitution with forced labor. Trafficking is defined as force, fraud, and coercion. And so we want those laws enforced. We want the laws of force, fraud, and coercion enforced right in our own backyards around the dancer issues who are involved in force, fraud, and coercion. And they're not enforcing those laws. Those are not the laws that are being enforced. They're enforcing the prostitution laws. Do you want to answer?
Oh, I just wanted to say that you can check this out here. Laura Augustine just put this up on the internet, and she's an expert on trafficking. Only 10% of the alleged trafficking cases in the United States in 2008 actually panned out to be trafficking cases. So 10%. They had brought in 1,229 alleged incidences of trafficking, and only 10% of those could wind up being for real. So the statistics are overblown.
Yeah, and they're used as an excuse to bar us from negotiating for our labor and our safe work conditions. Condoms are used as our safety device on our job. They're used as evidence to prosecute us for crimes for prostitution, right? So, you know, they don't really want us to have any agency here, and they certainly don't want people who are involved in force, fraud, and coercion to have any agency either. They either want them identified as victims, or they want them deported. And that's, you know, that's not what America is about.
I think you said it really well. Do you want to add something?
I mean, I was going to say that the problem with statistics goes a lot of ways. So the fact that only 10% of people, of cases that were believed to be trafficking were actually identified as trafficking is not necessarily reflective of the fact that those cases weren't trafficking. The INS often deports trafficked people rather than bothering to sit around and identify whether they've been trafficked or not. And also women and other trafficked people are afraid to come forward and continue because they are forced to collaborate. They're coerced and forced to collaborate with law enforcement in the prosecution of their trafficker, and often fear of retaliation against themselves or their family members, either in the U.S. or back home, stops them from doing that. So, but I completely agree with you that there's this whole notion that there's millions of trafficked women chained to beds out there somewhere that is not borne out by reality, and that it's used as a tool to actually prosecute and punish gender deviance, as I was talking about earlier. The other thing I wanted to say about it is that Sex Workers Project just put out a report on the use of raids to stop trafficking in persons, and particularly the use of anti-prostitution raids to address trafficking in persons. And, you know, they're not particularly helpful. I mean, people are not going to, after the cops have just kicked down the door, busted everyone, strip searched them publicly, beaten them, pistol whipped them, you know, handcuffed them and thrown them in a corner, you know, or thrown them in jail and say, yeah, were you forced? And are you undocumented? You know, and they'd be like, oh yes, I'm just going to disclose my entire trauma history to you right now. You know, it doesn't work. People see the police as what they are, which is their enemies and people who are trying to police, punish, or exclude them. On the other hand, what the report discovered was that people who are engaged in sex work voluntarily are among the best people to help locate people who have been trafficked. Because as you say, you know about it, you're working side by side with people, you know if something's not right. And in fact, most of the people who left trafficking situations who we talked to did so with the help of a coworker or one of those evil clients who was like, oh wait, you don't want to be doing this, I can tell, never mind, here's my cell phone, here's some money, go. And I'll cover for you to give you time to get away. Or coworkers doing that, laying them out the back door with money and a place to go 15 minutes before their trafficker would show up to pick them up from their shift at the brothel. I mean, those kinds of things are really what we need to be doing to address trafficking. But people who are engaged in sex work aren't going to are going to be prohibited or discouraged from really playing the central role in the fight against trafficking that they need to if they're criminalized along with the people who are being trafficked. And so criminalization doesn't help people who have been trafficked. It criminalizes them. It leads to them being deported, and it increases everyone's vulnerability to trafficking. So
Other question? Right here.
I just want to say this is my favorite panel so far. It was amazing, thank you. But one thing that I feel like was sort of glaringly absent from this panel and every other panel that I've been to today was a discussion of poverty and what the role of poverty is with not just your colleagues, but your clients, for the lawyers. Like talk about it like briefly but bigly.
Well, a lot of times when I give presentations to audiences, it's often people who, this is the first time they ever even thought about sex work, and they often ask, well, why do people do it? Why would they do it? And there's a lot of answers to that, but one answer is why do we work? We work so that we can make money, because that's the society that we live in, and so that we can survive. And that's why people do any kind of work. And I think that the role that poverty plays, I guess it's anything that's limiting people's options in terms of the kind of work that they choose to do. Whatever forces those are the forces we should be fighting against. So if your options of where to work and how to work are really limited by the fact that you don't have immigration status to work, and so you could do sex work, or you could there's not very many options left, and you don't want to do sex work, but that's the only option for you. We want to change that situation for people. So I think that's a big answer to the question, but I definitely would echo what all of us have said, which is that not all of sex workers are impoverished or are doing it because it's the only way to put food in their mouth or food in their children's mouth. Some maybe are, or some and then there are different class situations that people are in that do sex work, but even those assumptions, I think we need to really debunk by learning more about the realities of the sex industry.
And I think it's about looking at the sex industry as an industry like any other. There are people in the sex industry who are in oppressed work situations, even if it's not forced fraud or coercion, or who have no choice but to do the job that no one wants to do, or that's difficult to do, or under conditions that are horrific. There's no question about it. And yes, anti-poverty measures have to be part of our fight to bring justice and sexual liberation and other kinds of liberation to the work that we do.
If I may, I just want to add one thing. There's actually an Indian sex worker rights organization, and I have a problem saying their name, but if you go to
Karnataka.
Huh?
Karnataka in India?
That's not it, but Sanagachi, is that it? Anyway, if you go to my veronicamonday.com, I actually have links to those sex worker rights organizations. But the one in India, they want to rehabilitate the women by giving them sewing machines. And the women are just so pissed off. They're like, take your sewing machines and cram them up your ass. And one of the things that, this can be very insulting to somebody who feels that they have chosen a profession because they liked it. Now, obviously, there's going to be people who got into it when they didn't want to. And I personally have kind of come to see that there's probably two categories. And again, I'm a female, I'm going to focus on the feminist politics around here which affect women. There tends to be two groups of women who will get into the sex industry, and obviously there's far more than that. But if you do need to stereotype and make little boxes, please add a box is what I'm asking. So the sex industry is something that you don't need. If you're going to be working the streets, you don't have to have an address, you don't have to have a phone number, you don't have to have any ID, and you don't have to have an education. So for that reason, you can gain very easy entry to it, even if you are flat broke, or you just run away from home, you're homeless. So in that sense, and that feeds the stereotype that we have. Now those people are very real and they do exist, and if you feel like you have no choices and you go into the sex industry, it is a very personal profession, and I can see where it could be very abhorrent. And there's some women that have horrific tells about working in the sex industry. And just as some women have horrific tells about being married. And that's all I'm trying to do here, is like enlarge this conversation. Let's not invalidate the person who says, I've been happily married for 50 years and I love my husband, because somebody down the street is in the hospital fighting for her life because her husband tried to break every bone in her body. The same thing with prostitution. There are women who are college educated who wind up going into this industry, and you'll never hear about them or read about them because, why? Because they have their own private doctor, they don't go to clinics, they have an attorney to get them out of legal scrapes, and they have the resources to make sure that you don't find out about them. But why would they enter? A lot of times because they hit a glass ceiling, and they're fed up with that. So you actually have a lot of women in their 30s and 40s who go into this as a profession as well. So just create another box there.
In the green shirt?
Yes, I just, this was so refreshing, because the previous readings I've done about prostitution was a book called Not for Sale, and it's about what you mentioned, the second wave feminists, that actually you mentioned something about not letting women speak for themselves, and actually they were saying as you kind of people, like you are advocating for prostitution, are allies of capitalism, and that's not true, that you're minimizing the problem. What's your response to that? But I'd like to hear Marcina.
Well, it's all about labor rights. I mean, the answer to the poverty question is labor rights, right? I mean, the whole financial crisis that we're in right now is a result of workers not having a piece of the pie that the CEOs have walked off with everything, haven't they? Right? So it's not only, sex industry workers who need the right to negotiate for their labor and their work conditions. I think you all do too, right? Because that's the problem here. And I think, to think about your question, I'm thinking about a book. I was in Belém, Brazil, at the beginning of the month, attending the World Social Forum. There was a trade union, sex worker trade union formed there. And one of the books I encountered from South Africa was Selling Sex in South Africa, where they go through and basically dispute, every piece of not only the trafficking rhetoric that doesn't apply there, and dispute all the lies that people are being forced, that South Africa is a source of forced labor for women and girls, and it's also a destination place for women and girls. That they found that none of that was true. And they did an extensive, exhaustive, 2-year study. It's one of the best studies I've ever seen on the sex industry, because they had 2 auxiliary panels that reviewed all of the questionnaires. One was a sex worker panel, the other one was an academic panel. So they did a very thorough job of looking at, how the sex industry really works. It doesn't really work on the capitalistic system. When you really look at the sex industry, it doesn't really work that way. And that's why they don't want us to have any rights. They don't want us out there, advocating for ourselves. Because, if you give somebody like us the right to negotiate for her wage and her work condition and her labor, oh my God. Oh my God. It will create a whole new paradigm, right? And that's what we're all looking to do. Obama wants to create a whole new paradigm. We want to get out of this capitalist mess that we have ourselves in right now.
Could I just add one thing? I want to say that as far as capitalism goes, I actually, yeah, I'm not a socialist. Shoot me. And I always feel it's a little disingenuous coming from feminists who sell books and lectures to put capitalism down or put me down for making a buck when they're out there prostituting themselves too. And furthermore, there was a woman, she just recently passed on, but her name was Norma Homeling, and she was kind of a disciple of Melissa Farley. And Melissa Farley, look her up on the internet, she's like a big, person in the whole trafficking and prostitution is evil and it's rape thing. They started this organization called SAGE that was basically taking prostitutes off the street and putting them through the system, and then the clients had to pay $500 to take their workshop to teach them how they were raping all these poor prostitutes. They were making a lot of money. San Francisco was paying them to do this, and so we would go debate them, and they would accuse us of being these wealthy pimps. I mean, I got paid up to sometimes $15,000 a date, but I never became a millionaire doing that. I lived in a nice, suburban neighborhood, and a lot of our members didn't even have homes. And here these fat cats walk in and accuse us of being capitalist sellouts, and they've got a nice check from the state and from the city. It was very unnerving.
I mean, I think that it's completely disingenuous as an anti-capitalist to hear that argument as well, because, I mean, first of all, heteropatriarchy is like a central building block of capitalism. If they went back and read their Marx or whatever, they would see that. And then if they're supposedly being all anti-capitalist now, and then secondly, they're not examining their own role in the system or the role that their domestic worker, that the domestic worker who enables them to go out and be, the feminist that they are, and who she is and what role they play in her oppression. They don't look at, they're not out there fighting capitalism and other informal economies that they benefit from beyond, domestic work. I mean, it's just really, I think that there is legitimate anti-capitalist critique of the world and of various ways that we sell our bodies and our souls and our minds in exchange for survival. I don't know, I agree that focusing on this particular one is about other kinds of agendas, and that ultimately we are aware and work with people who organize themselves in different ways and are criminalized for that in the way that Sienna was saying. If you go to a sex worker cooperative that's anti-capitalist, you're all down for pimping or brothels or whatever. So
Right here in the front.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. I guess one is around the capitalist argument, and that would be that it's sort of, I think what you were just basically saying, but that we do, like every single day in every occupation, we sell ourselves. I mean, people are hurting their backs and their hands, and nurses are tortured, because their labor is just too physically intensive. And like we are doing that every day. We are selling our body, we're selling our health, and we're being exploited in those senses and have no control over that. And you could argue that at least a sex worker has chosen, or in some cases not chosen, but often you are choosing at least to determine to what extent you want to do that and have control over that. Whereas workers everywhere don't have control over how much they are selling their body in other ways. So that was just one comment. But the other, I guess more of a question I had, is I was watching some documentary about, I forget what country, but it was a country where prostitution was legal, and they were interviewing the women, and the women seemed to a certain extent empowered, because they were like, if I'm not comfortable with a client, that's it. Like, no, I'm not going to have sex with them, I'm not going to, and they seem to have a very empowered sense of being able to determine what they wanted to do in that room and what they didn't want to do, and could call the police if it went over the line. Like, there was a system where if you've been hit, if you've been hurt, you could address that because you weren't doing anything illegal to begin with. And so to me, that seems that should actually be a feminist way to look at things, is that that's an empowering thing, and I don't really see a strong argument for having a system where a woman cannot feel that she can go report that she has been hurt because somehow her job is not legal in the first place. I don't know if I'm being clear enough.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Did you have a question
Yeah, I guess my question.
related to that, or?
Actually, my question was
'Cause I have
thinking
comments.
about that kind of framework is whether there is any kind of international work on this, like if the coalition or efforts between sex workers here and sex workers in other countries. Or, I mean, I imagine it would be so financially difficult to bridge, but it seems like there's lots of commonalities, and whether there would be any room for strategizing on that level, like what's been effective there, if we can apply that here.
Okay, but
Yeah.
let's get that to Maxine.
Well, in Bel-Am, we talked about that, and I think that there's been a lot of discussion. There's the feminists, like Veronica, and, women who really see that equal protection is the #1 issue for women. And having that access to equal protection is the number one issue. And, but unfortunately, I think there's a big shattering inside the feminist movement that is anti-prostitution. That, I saw it in Proposition K. Women who were feminists, who worked on other social justice issues, who thought, prostitutes deserve to be arrested. We deserve to sustain the violence of being arrested and going to jail. That was a good thing in their mind. So there's a big split in the feminist movement about what our priorities are. I mean, as women in the United States, I think the statistics are that we only earn 76 cents on the dollar. And we only have access to abortion legally in 17 states. Yet we're paying first-class taxes. It goes back to that sort of, what are you getting here for your capitalism anyway?
One thing too, I just want to add is that actually we do. We have conferences. I attended a conference back in 1997, I think it was, an international conference on prostitution, which was in Van Nuys, California. And there were sex worker activists from around the world. And then the most recent one that I attended was 2005 up in Montreal. And again, it was sex workers from around the world. So, and then we have listservs, so we communicate with each other online constantly. And I mean, every time I open up my inbox, I'm getting to see what's going on in the UK, what's going on in Germany, what's going on in France, what's going on in Canada. And usually, I think we have conferences almost every year. I haven't attended all of them, but there's definitely, to me, it was very inspiring these 2 times that I went to the international conferences to just see the diversity and see the fact that even though we're all living under different laws in different countries, the commonality of our experiences was inspiring.
There's an international network of sex work projects that we're a member of that also tries to figure out ways to advocate internationally around particular issues, and that includes sex workers from India, one of which has a union of 60,000 sex workers in West Bengal who organize and keep the police out of their neighborhood unless they need them, etc. They're quite astounding, and they include all members of the industry, not just particular segments of it. And then there's groups in Cambodia and other places that are all members of this group. And one of the things that they've asked us to do, which is common in many international solidarity contexts, is to say, fix what's going on with what the U.S. is doing that's adversely impacting sex workers around the world. So Maxine referred to this, the money that Brazil turned down from the U.S. And the reason that they had to turn it down is because the U.S. has something called an anti-prostitution pledge, which if you take U.S. money, you have to say that you're not going to promote prostitution. Which then stops countries from doing, condom distribution among sex workers and health, among sex workers or whatever, but it is a condition of receiving U.S. aid. So one thing they've said to us is the biggest thing you can do for solidarity for us is to take away the anti-prostitution pledge. So if you were wondering what to say to, Obama next week, or Hillary next week when you email them, that's one thing.
Yeah. Down with PEPFAR.
So just 1 or 2 more questions, we're running short on time. Okay, right here.
I just have a really quick question for Maxine. You were talking about reframing the debate as one of labor rights. I just wondered what kind of success, if any, you've had in opening up a dialogue with labor unions.
Oh, that's a great question. So how I got started is from the labor organizing that went on with the Lusty Ladies in San Francisco. The Lusty Ladies is a peep show, a strip peep show that takes place behind plexiglass. So that group of workers don't interface, one-on-one where, with the customer. It's all done behind plexiglass. And they were able to organize as a union through Local Service Employees International, it was then Local 790, because they were already employees. So the unions decided to take them on because they already had employee status, where the rest of the sex industry works in an independent contractor status, and they're reluctant to take on independent contractors, and that's something that's going on throughout the whole labor community. So that's something that we talk about in the whole labor community. Because I think that we can go in and we can collectively negotiate those independent contractor contracts that the dancers are being forced to work in. We can do that. And, that those should still be recognized as valid, collectively negotiated contracts. We should be included in the AFL-CIO. So I go to the Labor Council, the San Francisco Labor Council, 2 times a month when they have their meetings. I don't have a voice there. I'm not a delegate from, one of the, AFL-CIO sanctioned labor unions, but I get up at the good of the council portion of the meetings and tell them what's going on, and I educate them about what's going on, and I build those relationships, because ultimately labor organizing is about building the relationships, and I'm here to build a relationship with you individually and as your groups. I want to build those relationships because eventually we're all going to be working together on something. We're going to be working on immigration reform, we're going to be working on something, and so it's best to get our coalitions together. So the AFL-CIO has the different caucuses. So they have a women's caucus called the Coalition for Labor Union Women. And this is a fascinating group of people because they're primarily black women. So it's great to go start working with labor union women on our issue, because nobody ever asks me, do you like your work? Nobody ever asks me, are you just doing it because you're poor? Do you have to? Do you have a pimp who's holding a gun to your head? Nobody ever asked me those questions in labor organizing, and it's so refreshing to be in the labor groups and out of the feminist groups. Let me tell you, it's a huge shift, and it's the best place to be, because at least they extend me the courtesy and the respect of being a worker first, right? And having to have those basic, access, worker rights. And so they've been instrumental in helping me get my voice into places like, the federales, to shut down, that horrible Trafficking Victim Reauthorization Protection Act. Some of those versions of those laws last year that were just awful. They wanted to expand the Mann Act. They wanted to say if I cross state lines, I traffic myself over here to Connecticut, I put a little ad up on Craigslist, get paid for the hotel room. I'm guilty of a felony. That's what they want. They want ordinary people, ordinary workers to be criminalized around our sexuality, and it doesn't help people who are involved in forced labor. Not one bit. It doesn't help anybody. It only makes money for the prison industrial complex. And that's what a lot of these NGOs, who get all this money for this anti-trafficking victim rhetoric, they are an extension of the prison industrial complex. And we want to shut them down. We want to take their money, right? We want to take all the police's money, because, it's a waste of money. It's not the best spent money. It's not the best way to use our resources. I don't even know what I was talking about.
Let's just say the people who are so interested in sex trafficking are not particularly interested in labor trafficking, which is actually where most of the forced fraud or coercion takes place. Again, because they're the feminists who are maybe trafficking their own domestic work. Right.
Last question.
That's excellent.
Right here at the end. Red shirt.
In the red shirt.
I had a question. Ms. Monet mentioned the statistics around people consuming porn, and Andrew Ritchie kind of mentioned situations where Johns can help prostitutes who are in coercive situations get out. And I was wondering, insofar as there's a sex industry, how can people who consume sex become more kind of ethical sex consumers? I was reading a website of kind of a progressive website about how you can you be a progressive John? Can you participate in the industry from that end with kind of an ethical, with a way to.
Yes.
Right. But is there a dialogue about which sex businesses are
Well,
keeping their
there's
workers fairly?
there's
Which
actually
strip clubs don't charge stage fees which porn.
There's some good guidelines that I can give you right off the top of my head. And first and foremost, if you were looking for a provider, an escort, you don't want to go through an agency. Now, not all agencies are oppressive. Some of them are actually very convenient because maybe you're a college student, you don't want to run pictures of yourself, you don't want to have it on your cell phone, and so this is how you can build some distance between you and what you're doing so that it hopefully won't impact your future career. But it becomes very difficult to research an agency because we're talking about an underground economy. So if you just rule that out and you go for independent escorts who have their own website and they're not hiding their face, they're showing you, this is my face, this is me, you are getting somebody who is probably more likely to feel very empowered and identified with the profession and take quite a bit of pride in it. That's one. If you're purchasing pornography, I would stay away from the big production houses. Most of the big production houses are ripping off the performers. You know, Jenna Jameson produces her own stuff, and she's a millionaire. You know, so if you bought her stuff, you probably would not be getting an oppressed woman. Candida Royale, Nina Hartley, Annie Sprinkle, some of these women have gone out of their way to produce porn that they consider feminist or that they consider woman-friendly. And I would say put money in their wallets because they're not part of big business and it's a woman-owned industry. So, and same thing with strip clubs. You know, if you're going to something that's woman-owned or is cooperative, like, you know, somebody who has their workers actually employed by the union, probably less oppressive. You go to some of the big names, you know, like in our town, we've got Mitchell Brothers and Century Theater. I mean, those people are so corrupt and with local law enforcement that I wouldn't give them a dime of my money. Go.
Well, my response to that is that, you know, when we're looking in labor organizing, you never do anything to affect a worker's economy without that worker's, you know, permission. You know, one of the reasons why we don't, as a society, go after Walmart is because those Walmart workers have not stood up and said, hey, we're in a oppressive situation, boycott our product, right? That's not what they're saying. Walmart workers don't say that. And we in the sex industry, you know, don't say that. And the problem with the customers being ethical is a sort of an issue here because once again, you're dealing with people who have male privilege, right? So you're dealing with what we call in the labor rights organizing, in the sex industry organizing, you're dealing with a third-party boss. So you see a lot of you know, customers being concerned about, you know, wanting to spend money, you know, with people that they, you know, feel like have their common values here. But the problem is that a lot of the those websites that talk about the workers end up exploiting the workers by rating our faces on a scale of 1 to 10. Rating our services on a scale of 1 to 10. They might not be telling the truth about what kind of services we're providing or what kind of rates we're actually providing. So they might be setting the worker up for a bad negotiation for the next customer who may misunderstand or misread that, you know, particular review about that worker. That's why negotiating for our labor on our own terms is so important. Whether you're negotiating with the client, whether you're negotiating with an agency, whether you're negotiating, you know, with hiring a driver who's going to drive you around all night, you need to have that negotiation honored. You know, you need the right to be able to negotiate on all those different kinds of levels. So when you're looking at customers at being the center of trying to be ethical, it's kind of a mixed bag there, really, you know, when you're talking about, you know, negotiating with a third-party boss when he's criminal too, but yet he gets all the privilege of putting up all of our information. He puts up our address, he puts up, you know, what color my underwear is, you know, he's putting up all this stuff about me that's putting me at risk for being busted. And who does that serve when I get busted? Well, that might serve him. Because then, you know, he's not dealing with some old timer like me, right? You get some old gal like me in the room, you know, you're not going to be able to run game on me, are you? No. You get, you know, some younger woman in the room who's filling the vacuum, who doesn't have a lot of highly negotiated sexual boundaries professionally. That's a big deal, right? So you get to get more bang for your buck when you get, you know, somebody who doesn't have as much experience in the room. So there's an investment for customers and police who work hand in hand sometimes together to see turnover in, you know, who's available, who, you know, and service providers. So that's why it's really important, we've got to have workers get to the center. We have got to get control over our own labor and our own ability to negotiate for ourselves individually and collectively.
Now, I would, okay, well, I just wanted to say one more thing about that, and it's just, I agree with everything she said, and yet we're not there yet. So in the meantime, I want you all to get laid. So, you know, I always think about my dog has so much common sense, you know? I mean, a lot of times I would let him pick the contractors who were going to be remodeling my house because he would know a good guy from a bad guy, and I didn't have that sense. You know, as an escort, I learned to develop this intuitive side of me, and I would just like invite you to develop the part of you that, you know, how sometimes you can kind of tell somebody's pretending they're in a happy marriage, but they're not really in a happy marriage, and there's other friends of yours that you really can tell that they're just, you know, brimming over with joy, and they really love being married, and then there's people you think, oh my God, they should have never gotten married. If you're able to make those kind of distinctions in your day-to-day relationships with people, sex workers are just people. And if you're thinking of them as a person, then if you're talking to them on the phone, or you're meeting them in person, or you're just looking at their body language and maybe the art that they produce, you'll be able to train yourself to actually see them as people and see that there's ones who are not empowered, there's ones who are obviously drug addicted, and sort your way through that just like you do with your friends and your family. But you have to wake up and not like try to put them in a little box, you know, and so all sex workers are over here. They're not. There's a lot of things in the sex industry I find incredibly repugnant. And I'm not about shutting them down. I'm about creating legalities so that the laws we already have can go in and be used to protect us.
Yeah, I just feel really honored to be on the panel with both of you, and it's because when we talk about decriminalization, I feel like that's sort of it's important work, but it's reactive work. It's reacting to the system that we live in, and the labor organizing part of it is sort of the proactive approach. And I think that when you think about like clients having organizing or being ethical, just to echo that if that's going to happen, it has to be led by the workers, and that there's so much potential there, because if there were really safe and ethical environments to do sex work, like what would it mean to have sexual harassment laws active for sex workers? What would it mean to have non-discrimination laws happening in the sex industry? It could be really transformative, not only of the sex industry but of sexuality, for our society. And so but that it has to be led by the people that are most affected and centered those folks, as you said.